This is my third year at the Aspen Ideas Festival. My name is Ta-Nehisi. I'm a senior editor at The Atlantic. But by far, this is, for me, I think going to be the most pleasurable panel that I've had. Many, many years ago, when I was a young man and an undergraduate, many of the people who I'm here on this panel with, I studied their works, and so they were sort of professors in absentia for me. So it's just an incredible privilege. We have Claude Steele, who's the provost at Columbia. You guys are going to have to forgive me. I didn't know I was doing the introduction, so my introductions are the conversation will be better than the introduction. We have Ellis Cose from Newsweek, who I know from his book, Rage of the Privileged Class, which was huge when I was in college and still reverberates today. We have Patricia Williams, who's at Columbia Law School. Columbia is very well represented up here today, and who also writes a column for The Nation, Diary of a Mad Lawyer. I got that right, didn't I? Law professor. Okay, all right. Okay, got it. And David Levering-Lewis, who's at NYU, esteemed historian, author of When Harlem Was in Vogue, award-winning 2-volume Du Bois biography. I have to say, so when I saw the title for this panel and I saw the word post-racial, and I have to say I blanched a little bit. I see that word, I get a migraine like right away. Thank you. Yeah, like virtually immediately, but that's okay. I didn't build a panel, but we're going to go there. But my question for you guys is, why do we keep hearing that word? What does it mean to people? Does it reflect some sort of latent desire that we have to go somewhere for Obama, for a person to take us somewhere that maybe we need to do the work to do? I guess that's a bit of a leading question, but I'm going to throw that out there, and I'll start down here with Claude, if you don't mind.
Sure. I'll start with an experiment that illustrates a point which I think is involved in answering your question. This comes from the social psychology literature, but if you give a group of people who've been historically disenfranchised, if you give them, even a small percentage of them, a chance to join the mainstream and for upward mobility, that kind of thing, you give a small 3%, 2% of them, then you start to see a shift away from the idea of collective political action in behalf of the group and a shift toward individual achievement and focus on individual opportunity and the like. So I think in part, when I compare these days to my youth of the civil rights era in the 60s and so on, I think something like that's going on where there's a greater interest in individual means of mobility and a lesser interest, Ellis and I were talking about this last night, a lesser interest in the idea of collective action as a part of your group identity, mobilizing, moving the group forward. I think there's less of that at play. And certainly an Obama presidency puts a real fine point on that wow, the President of the United States is African American. So I think that's a huge signal that has that. That's one fact. The other fact, though, is that if you look at racial inequalities in terms of health care, health outcomes, education, criminal justice, wealth, these racial inequalities are still there, and in some instances even greater than they have been. They're even increasing in the last 20 years or so. So at the same moment when I think the whole society has a greater hope that racial inequality will be overcome by individual effort and focus, there is at the same time this reality that these inequalities are still incredibly profound, and they reflect our history. They reflect the structures of society and how they recapitulate these inequalities and the like. And there will be, I suppose, the implication of what I'm saying, there may be less interest in collective attention to these issues than there has been in the past as we shift toward a more individualistic focus toward remedy. And that's a concern. That's a concern about the whole notion of a post-racial era that we're moving into. There's a good side to it, but there's this real issue of us perhaps ignoring something that's profound. I'll end by saying I think I admire the Obama strategy, and maybe it embodies a new strategy, which is to focus on issues that disproportionately would rectify racial inequalities, like healthcare.
Right.
That's something that you can cast as something that incorporates everybody. It's a national, inclusive concern, but it disproportionately affects disenfranchised groups, and that may be the kind of strategy going forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're asking us, in effect, to put America on the couch, because it goes heavy into psychology as to why this thing pops up. I mean, and then that's obviously Claude's field much more than it is mine. I have yet to meet a black person, African American, who believes we're in a post-racial society. I have yet to meet that person. So the question is, why does this phrase keep coming up? And before I address that, you mentioned The Rage of a Privileged Class. So it's a book I published about a decade and a half ago. And I'm doing some research now for what in some ways is a follow-up book. And part of the research that I'm conducting a survey of roughly 200 black Harvard MBAs and posed a whole series of questions to them. One of the questions was how much discrimination do various groups face in American society. When I asked it about whites, 96% said none. 3% said a little in terms of how much discrimination whites face. When asked about African Americans, 60% said a lot, 39% said some, 1% said a little, nobody said none. When I asked them themselves, do you face discrimination in your own workplace? 79% said, yes, we do. Do you face discrimination outside the workplace? 89% said, yes, we do. Now, this is talking about a privileged group. I mean, 40% of this group have reported a household income of over $400,000 a year. So these.
And just to get clear, are they talking about themselves, or are they talking about African Americans at large?
They're talking about themselves in terms of discrimination that they face. 79% discrimination against in society at large. The total came to 99%, basically. Mm-hmm. So they're talking about both. Mm-hmm. And they're talking about discrimination both at the workplace and outside the workplace. So you have a group of people who are among the most privileged people in American society of any race, right. Who are saying they still occupy a world in which discrimination is a very constant and real factor for them. So to get back to your question, why do we even have this discussion about this being a post-racial society? I think it's because there is a huge psychological investment in wanting to believe we are at least getting there, and that's on the parts of a lot of people, many of them white, some of them black. I mean, there was a poll that got a lot of attention after during the inauguration week that Gallup released. And the question was, do you think Martin Luther King's dream has been achieved? The vast majority of African Americans said yes. Now, the dream was not defined, and if you probed that, I think you might have gotten a different answer, but the inclination was to say, wow, we've made some huge advance. And I think Shelby Steele, a different person than Claude, I should say, right, has been arguing for years about this white guilt thing, mm-hmm, and the fact that it should not exist. Certainly one way to get rid of white guilt is to assume we have a society which is post-racial. Mm-hmm. Is to assume we have a society in which race no longer is much of a factor. So to the extent you can believe that, then there's no necessity at all to even entertain the idea of feeling guilty, because in fact we've reached this society in which the dream has been achieved, and we'll reach this society in which African Americans, those who are willing to work, those who are willing to put forth the effort, those who are willing to educate themselves, have as good a chance as whites do. I mean, it reminds me a little bit. For years there was this concept in Brazil, the racial democracy, democracia. I mean, this whole idea that they just didn't see race. They'd gotten beyond that, and yet when you look at how society actually functioned and still functions in Brazil, you saw that the elites were almost always white, and the ones who were non-elites were disproportionately of color of one sort or another. But it was a useful myth, and it helped ease the friction that otherwise would have existed in that society. So to sort of wrap up, why do we have this discussion? Well, it's a provocative term for the media to toss around. But in addition to it being a provocative term for the media to toss around, I think it's a useful way for people who want to step away from any sort of responsibility for the lingering impact of this heritage of discrimination to deal with it.
I think that there not only do very few African Americans believe that we're in a post-racial movement, I also think that very few white people really believe that we're in a post-racial movement in some general sense. And so my reading of the term post-racial is really that it's a post-remedial moment, that as it gets used by the larger and generally, in white media at any rate, it's really about wanting to terminate the kinds of legal remediation like affirmative action, or that there's no need for it. And so I see or hear post-racialism as a kind of new exceptionalism, which has always existed about, in the Old South, the myths of the good Negro and so forth. But the usefulness of, or the utility of exceptionalism is that it proves the rule. That is to say that if the rest are on the bottom and you have this exception, then all the rest could be just like that if only you worked hard enough or got yourself neater or cleaner. And so when I look at Obama, it feels like he has sort of rotated through almost, well, I can think of at least 6 different versions of exceptionalism. First of all, starting with Biden's neat, clean, no baggage, no ghetto, and so forth. Which again sends the message that if only you would act more like this, if you were neat and clean, then you would, then the rest wouldn't be like that. Then there was a kind of flirting through Reverend Wright, in which he sort of did become, so he didn't just exceed people's expectations; he became everybody's worst expectation, buffoonish, radical, white-hating, and so forth. And Obama recuperated from that. He did it through his elegant speech. But in that recuperation, I think he confounded the media again. It was very hard to categorize him. He became, and so he was sort of forced over time in the wake of that, not just to be exceptional, but to be sort of elitist. He was accused of being very elite, not just in, certainly there was some part of the African American community said that he was too white. But again, I'm talking about the larger, the general media, in which he became arrogant and uppity. There were a lot of, he went through a whole period in which that was really, whether his arrogance or his sedittiness or whatever, his elitism, his Eastern elitism, was a specific, subspecies of Eastern WASP elite that afflicted African Americans who, quote, didn't know their place. And you heard that vocabulary a lot thrown around in certain part of the campaign. Then, there was a lot of fascination with his biracialism, so that he was a new phenomenon that we've never, ever seen in American history before, even as it reiterated a lot of post-Reconstruction politics. And I thought he was masterful in sort of using some of the rhetoric of political placement, the history of political placement. For example, the immigrant myth. Very few politicians really get anywhere without being able to staple themselves onto the immigrant myth, except his immigrant father came from Africa. So this was sort of, how do you place that? And then, his pioneer, slave-holding, slave-descending ancestors were the white Nebraska side of his family. And people were confused by that. And ultimately, it seems to me that while he was masterful in all of this, and it really allowed him to be heard in ways that I think he would not have been heard if he'd been more conveniently and traditionally stereotyped, he's resisted it so well that he ended up being uncategorizable and unstereotypical, typable. And unfortunately, it's almost that he's come to rest in something which is alien. And it has been literally categorized as alien, which is to say that he's been pushed into that box which is foreign,
Kenyan Muslim.
with undocumented, Kenyan Muslim, part of the immigrant wave that's about to take over, and the degree to which he is something which is perhaps a part of a new diasporic American citizenship, which is cosmopolitan, which is multilingual, which is educated from all kinds of interdisciplinary perspectives, is completely lost, I'm afraid, in a moment that is increasingly nativist, know-nothing, anti-intellectual to a great degree, or at least the aspersions which are being cast on him come from that. And so I think it's a tension ultimately, not just between whether we're in a post-racial moment, but whether we're also sort of resisting the internationalism, the cosmopolitanism, the lack, in a moment of defunded education, resistance to learning other languages and other ways in a globalized economy. And that, it seems to me, is the essence of his essence as a representative of the American dilemma, the new American dilemma.
No, but that seems to me a wonderful iteration of the many representations that Obama has meant to the American public. Post-racial, the mythos of that it has a statistical oddity, though, it seems to me, and that is that if it is that we empowered a person who will advance a democracy which incorporates all the things we want that give us the ideal social contract. The point is that, of course, 2008 in November, the majority population, then still white Americans, did not vote for Obama, but voted for John McCain and Sarah Palin. Most of us have elided that inconvenient statistic, but by 12%, white Americans went for the Republican candidate. But then fast forward, and we have the almost ululation about the new era of post-racialism. And it is, as Claude Steele suggests, a worthwhile agenda, perhaps, however disbelieving most African Americans are that we are at this moment in time there, or white Americans wondering how long and what cost will be incurred in order to get there. But the fact that he did not receive the mandate that has been fictionally presented has a lot to do, it seems to me, with the fact that at this point there is a fragmenting of the constituencies that have empowered him and that hope he will achieve their agendas.
You mean the African American?
That is, not only the young African Americans, the people who are concerned about ecology, the people who are concerned about education.
But David, let me ask you a question though, because not since LBJ has a Democratic candidate got the majority of white votes in this country. So to what extent do you read Obama not getting them as just a phenomenon of the fact that Democrats since 1964 have not gotten a majority of white votes in the presidential contest? Obama actually got more than his predecessor running for the presidency. So to what extent do you interpret that in some way racially, and to what extent is it simply Democratic versus Republican politics?
And can I just pile on top of that and add, to what extent is that also racialized?
Well, I sort of going back in real time, just before the economic crash, whatever we're calling it, the Great Recession, it was an open question, more than an open question. I think one might well have thought that Obama would not win. It would have been a close election. It turns out that post the recession and the poor performance of the McCain team, Obama became far more credible and was a appropriate hook for panic. So it seems to me that we have two things going on. The majority population probably with a considerable number of those who did in fact finally vote for Obama, voting for the Republicans, And then the Great Recession reduces that number. Nonetheless, the majority of the white voters do, in this crisis, still vote for McCain and Palin. I bring that up only because as one becomes more and more concerned about where we are going historically, the dubiety that now begins to burble up and is being expressed through the Tea Party anguish begins indeed to pollute the atmosphere in ways that Patricia Williams was saying, where all the things that should be positive valences in Obama become things of concern. What his alterity suddenly becomes a prepossession. He's an American, yes, but what kind of American? He's self-invented in very odd ways. If you read this marvelous book by David Remnick, which does such a fine job of reconstructing Obama as he constructed himself, you can see there are two ways to read the phenomenon. One is of someone who has made himself so many things that if you become highly critical as the economic situation doesn't improve, he then gets picked apart. And things that should be a plus become a minus. Things that are a minus become, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, a plus. So that post-racialism, it seems to me, was premised on a vote that suggested, when you looked at it, that we were going to be in for times of great turbulence in terms of committing ourselves to of a post-racial America. And it may well be that as we decide that we're not in a post-racial moment, there could be another paradigm in which we might say it is the accommodation of race in order to make the American promise fully worthy of itself. In other words, not stepping away from race, but bringing it into the mix of aspirations.
Stepping into the punch. Patricia, you very eloquently talked about the many iterations of the many public iterations of Barack Obama throughout the campaign, and there have been many iterations of himself throughout his life. My question is how much of this, and please feel free to jump in anyway. I address this to Patricia because she brought it up. How much of that reflects the singular aspects of Obama, who, as we all know, has an incredible story and an incredible narrative, and how much of it reflects a diversity that was always true in the African American community? Frederick Douglass had a great story too. Is it specific to him, or does it say something broader about who we are and where we are at this point right now?
I think it's both. It is absolutely both. What I was trying to emphasize is the degree to which I think it's been somewhat relabeled and refashioned, but there have been remarkable characters in our political history before, and he shouldn't be isolated from that, and particularly this exceptionalism.
Right.
And the way it's worked around him, I think is a very important factor to recognize, because it gets repeated so much throughout our history, and I think it's blinding. But at the same time, he is an exceptional person. Somebody called him earlier the Michael Jackson the Michael Jordan, I'm sorry. The Michael Jordan.
Let's hope not the Michael Jackson.
Forgive me. The Michael Jordan of the political
Michael
world.
Jackson might
Yes.
work too.
And let me say, I really resist both, the analogies to, because there's a way in which our citation for marvelous accomplishments of African Americans always reaches either the entertainment world or the sports world, and so I raise either of them to sort of resist that to some degree. At the same time, because he is so genuinely a remarkable person, truly a remarkable person on many, many levels, and again, I recommend the David Remnick book, because I think it really reminds you that Horatio Alger might be a better category, than Michael Jordan. That he is somebody who skipped classes, that is to say, social classes, and rose to the top like cream because of who he is and his abilities, which are quite remarkable. But that, and I think that very quality of genuine exceptional ability, not exceptionalism, is something which gave rise to, and this is perhaps the good side of the hopes for post-racial, I mean, not achieved, but actually the aspiration to that, which was that he was a little bit like Jesus Christ. He was Martin Luther King. He was all of the dreams of the civil rights movement come to a head. Even David Remnick's book poses him as the
Joshua generation.
The Joshua generation,
yes.
Yeah. So that there's something mythic, there's something prophetic, there's something very narratively powerful about his life that is both rooted in who he is, but also, I think, is similarly blinding in the individual sense.
Right.
And I think that's the part that it creates much disappointment in many people. If you actually looked at Obama, what he was saying, who he was, where he came from, as brilliant as he is, he was always a centrist. He was always a University of Chicago economics person, right up there. And he was not somebody who was as spectacularly likely to deliver us from bondage as Moses, as Martin Luther King. And so in that way, the media, I think, or the expectations of him set him up for some degree of disappointment or for a reality check.
But that
I don't
Moses
think we should be
person could
disappointed.
never have been elected.
Well, I think to some degree we thought we were electing. I mean, some people
I
thought they were
some
electing
people
Moses.
thought they were electing him.
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of it. Other people thought they were electing something very different. Yeah. I mean, the first time that I met Mr. Obama was in Kenya, actually, in the Serena Hotel in Nairobi. He had gone there, and this before he had announced that he was going to run. It was in 2007. It was part of his trip through Africa. That he was making his first big foreign policy trip as a senator, other than the one he had made to Russia before that. But this first one he's making by himself, and so he didn't have the Secret Service around him. It was him and his press secretary and a few other folks, and et cetera. And at one point, we had a conversation, and somehow we got into this conversation about his appeal to different people. And he smiled at one point, and he said, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, I know a lot of different people see different parts of me that they can relate to. And he was in effect acknowledging, if you want to see Moses in him, fine, you can see that. If you want to see his white parentage in him, fine, you can see that. If you want to see the centrist Democrat in him, fine, he'll let you see that. None of it is inauthentic. But the phenomena, he's a bit of a shapeshifter in that sense. You see what you want to see with him, and so a lot of people brought.
Is that on him though, or is it on us?
I'm not saying it in a pejorative sense. I think he acknowledges that he's a politician. Any politician is going to want to be as broadly popular as he can, and if a politician thinks, well, this part of me appeals to you, and then that's the part he's going to show you. Which is not to say that part is not real.
Right.
It's just that there is an emphasis on it. But I think there's and then underscoring the fact he's a politician. I think any black politician who's trying to appeal to a white constituency knows that it's not within your interest to push any sort of agenda that suggests race. So you ask about why this whole thing of post-racialism. Well, certainly, someone like Obama was not going to confront that directly, except for the one time he had to in his speech. To get away from Obama for a second, look at what happened just this year to Altura Davis, who was trying to become the first black governor from Alabama.
Right.
He decided that in order to appeal to the constituencies he was trying to reach, he basically had to distance himself from anything that was considered black, pretty much. I refused to sit for endorsement sessions with the long-time standing black political organizations. essentially refused to acknowledge that there were any issues that had anything to do with race.
Voted against healthcare too, right?
And he voted against the Obama's healthcare program. The only black congressman to do so. I think part of what he lost the primary. He didn't even get to the general election. He lost the primary. And he lost a lot of black votes because he just assumed that he was going to leap into the general election, that the black folks were going to go with him, and white liberals were going to make a coalition. But whatever he assumed, it didn't work out. But but part of that bedrock assumption that he had was that he had to basically distance himself not only from blacks but from race, period, which gives rise to the whole talk of post-racialism, because he's sort of presenting himself. Right. Same thing with Harold Ford when he ran in 2006 for the senator from Tennessee. He tried to present himself in such a way that he could find that to the extent he could finesse race. For the first time, you heard broadly about his white grandmother, which you hadn't heard much of her before. And he did a number of things. And ultimately, his campaign, he lost narrowly. He lost by between 2 and 3%. And a lot of people attribute that loss to a very racialized ad that was aired at the end.
Right. Call me Harold.
The blonde woman saying she had met him at the Playboy Mansion. Harold, call me. That. It was that. So, but my point, or one of my points at least here, is that one of the reasons that I think we have this dialogue about post-racialism, specifically related to certain candidates, is because these candidates try to sort of present themselves as post-racial in some sense.
Well, perhaps Claude, you can correct me, but we were both at a forum fairly recently when it was said that the Pew polling, which shows Obama falling rather precipitously, but holding steady at a point of a little bit before 50% approval, and that when you disaggregate the elements that give you that result, it is that the African American responses have been unilaterally and stupendously positive. 99% say is our president and we are with him. On the other hand, in that audience, a number of African Americans said, we rather find ourselves living with the mantra of grin and bear it. I suppose that goes to your point, Ellis, about that fine balance between a supervening agenda or an objective agenda in which all of us are to benefit, and on the other hand, the reality that a significant percentage of the Obama constituency is appallingly disadvantaged in time and place. Now, it doesn't mean, I'm sure, that in November or even farther down the road, African Americans are not going to applaud the Obama phenomenon, but it may mean that the enthusiasm go out of the commitment, and that we face a situation in which, on the right, there is great energy and determination to take back the country. With African Americans, there is a increasing anguish about what this means in terms of real-time remediation of a situation, with a great desire indeed to accept rising tide lifting all boats, so that this sort of terpsichore of racial appeal that is racialized bedevils him and bedevils indeed the public, because at the end of the day, it is probably true that if the November election goes the way the predictions have it, Americans down the road will much regret the result. Election quite negative, and therefore imperil an agenda which at the end of the day is better for most of us in terms of education And one hopes also in terms of unnecessary warfare. Question mark to be drawn.
Before you, can I ask you one other question, because I'm dying to get this in. We kind of have gone around this issue of identity and Obama. We haven't head-on addressed the whole biracial question. There was a recent story in which it was reported that he had checked black on his census form, and this caused quite a bit of a hubbub. I was not so much surprised, but I wonder, and I know David posed the question too, so you can take them in order that you want, but I wonder to what extent do you think there was ever a choice? Did he make a choice? Was there a quote-unquote Tiger Woods option? Is it different when you're in politics? Was there ever a choice in his mind, do you think, that he could be something else?
I don't think so. I think Obama, one way of saying this is I just titled the book Whistling Vivaldi, and it comes from a story that happened to Brent Staples, who's an editorialist for the New York Times, and it refers to he was in graduate school at the University of Chicago. He'd walk down the street, he realized he was making whites uncomfortable, and they would avoid him and so on and cross the street. And he just incidentally learned that if he whistled Vivaldi, they would relax, and then he could relax. And I think one way of saying Obama's genius is that he has whistled Vivaldi so amazingly well. And I think he did it with a very specific story. His story, the specifics of it enables a lot of people to identify with parts of it and to minimize the threat about his being black, so that they could embrace black. People want to do that. They want to find that. I had a conversation with some old colleagues the other day at lunch. All of them, there were four of us, and they were white. And one guy just sort of burst out in the middle of the conversation and said, since Obama has been elected, am I crazy? But are black people treating me a little bit more nicely than they used to? I think there's an appetite for an honest, straight up human appetite for people to come together in a good spirit, and I think the election of Obama is something that really occasions us to examine. Are we there? Are we getting close to that? Are we in an era when that's something that we can really be proud of about being Americans? And I think, but I do think maybe, he is, this is such an improbable event, somebody with all these talents and somebody with this mixed identity, which we would have all told him 5 years ago, forget it. With that kind of an identity, you can't get elected to be the President of the United States. You've got too many problems. Who's going to be are black people going to back you, or who else? We would have seen that as a problem, but with this story, he discovered, like probably Brent Staples whistling Vivaldi, that it enabled a lot of people to identify with him. And so I think there's some almost magic in that stroke, and that's part of what happened here. But I do share David's concern that there's a shadow of these lingering and profound inequalities. I go to the airport from Morningside Heights over to LaGuardia through 125th Street. I know you do too, and you do. You can't go through Harlem without wondering, wow, what is going to move this? What's going to make a difference here? And you look at every area of American life, and you see these inequalities and their mysterious, almost mysterious persistence. And you hope that in this moment, that this shadow, that Obama, because I think he really is I take him as a more straight-ahead person and I trust his good intentions, that he will try to deal with these. That same thing we were at, I think Charles Blow, the editorialist, gave a talk, and he said, people want him to have a black agenda, but that's obviously ridiculous. He can't have a black agenda. But what he can have is an agenda that happens to hit the major issues that are impacting African Americans and other disenfranchised groups, and that may be the way we go forward, that he may steer us in that direction. Now, as an older guy, whether I think that's going to be enough or not, I don't know. But I think that may be the most viable political way to mobilize attention to these issues in the future.
I mean, he's clearly not going to have a black agenda, but if you talk to his folks in the White House, what they will tell you very quietly and very softly is that they think he's doing more for black folks than any other president. And they will say, just watch his agenda. He's never going to say that out loud. Right. But they will argue that that's what he's doing. And I think, but I think at the same time, you do have this sort of phenomenon where a number of people have touched on it already, where his very success makes it harder to argue that you need some efforts to address these problems that remain and which are clearly rooted in large measure in our racial history.
And it's a very difficult position for him to be in because although he does benefit in many ways from how he deploys his, quote, biracial status, biracialism itself is an extraordinarily fragile status. Right. Many people who are clearly African American and perceived as radically so are the product of what are called biracial unions. Right. I mean, this is part of the history, but biracial sort of came about as almost a legitimizing category for people who are the product of a married one black parent and one white parent. But the degree to which every African American in the United States is the product of some sort of multiracial
look at our beautiful
union,
panel.
Legitimate, yes, legitimate or not. But in terms of, the children of those unions, literally, in order to profit from it, like Barack Obama, literally has to have the parents on either side of them at all times saying, "Look, this is our offspring." Because otherwise, the moment they lose the backing or the visibility of those parents, people like Lonnie Guinier, she wasn't greeted as our biracial candidate for the Civil Rights Division. She was Looney Lonnie, the quote queen. Right. Your parentage. I mean, it's invisible on a day-to-day basis, and therefore it makes absolute sense that that you can't escape that category. Now, he's, at the same time as that has faded away, and the black family with a black first lady, it seems to me that he's lost some of that grace or gratitude or appeal, however artificial that appeal is, and it's a dangerous moment. The second thing that it seems to me is that like all exceptions, like the good Negro in the South, you really also risk it with the phenomenon of a tipping point. And what happened to him even during the campaign when Oprah Winfrey came out, her first political adoption or endorsement of a candidate, that was the first time, not only did his polls suddenly flutter about a bit, her polls went down and have continued to go down as she's become more political about this. And it's literally like two black people on a stage. And it was this very weird moment. It was this very in which Hillary Clinton was appearing at black churches every Sunday, surrounded by, and just like the Bushes, always surrounded by black school children, right. And the black backdrop for politicians, particularly our presidential candidates, has always signaled something that, I care about humanity, kumbaya, we are the world. But a black presidential candidate couldn't do that. And it was very odd to sort of see Barack Obama avoiding not only his own church, but black churches generally, congregations generally, and instead being surrounded by what ultimately turned out to be Oprah Winfrey's real audience, which was a whole bunch of white soccer moms from suburbia.
Can I follow up on that last point? I wonder, there's also been some criticism of the fact that when he has appeared in front of black congregations, he has a decidedly different message than what he takes to white churches, and there's a lot about cutting off the video games.
As Ellis said, I mean, he's a phenomenal code switcher, and he allows people to identify with that part of himself which he presents. He's lived many places. He is somebody who is, not just multilingual, but he can inflect his language in ways that reflect the rhetoric of the audience with which he speaks. And I do distinguish that. I distinguish that from what is projected onto him, because I do think that part of the appeal is not just that he code switches, but also that being black means that many people attribute a degree of radicalism to you that simply ignores who you are. And I think that in that sense, that was what I was talking about originally. It's the same thing that, unfortunately, Clarence Thomas benefited from. People like M.I. Angelou were saying, I can't believe he would actually be that conservative after all. And they were willing to support him despite his actual record. Right. And I think that the same thing, if in a different direction, affected people who expected him to be a much more radical Democrat or much more radically embracing of certain causes. But that was mere projection, and that's the projection is what I was concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, to shift a little bit, I think part of the problem with this discussion about post-racialism, Obama, biracialism, et cetera, is that it's a little bit premature. I mean, you talked about the fact that throughout history, Black Americans have been accustomed to this idea that many of us have all kinds of ancestry, but we also accepted the fact that under the American rules of engagement, there was this so-called one-drop rule, which meant that even if you had 3 white grandparents and 1 black one, you were black. Right. There was never this option of being something other than black in America. What the Census Bureau, I think, acknowledged census back when they decided to open it up to the biracial category is that they're getting more and more resistance to that. And I think eventually, not probably during my lifetime, but eventually this one-drop rule is going to disappear. Right. Eventually, we are in fact going to have people who can tell you, as they tell you in Brazil, well, my father's black, but I'm not. Or one of the big problems in certain Caribbean and Latin American countries, they're not comfortable being called white, and they're not comfortable being called black. They're trigueño, they're mulatto, they're something else. They're somewhere in between. And I think one of the results of this increasing Latinization of America is that way of looking at race is going to also come into play here, in addition to the fact that you do have more and more biracial couples, and kids are saying, well, I want to be able to acknowledge my mother's ancestry too, or my father's ancestry too, and why should I be prevented from doing that? I think that's an evolving phenomena. But
so, does that perhaps play into the backlash and the reaction? The demographics are not encouraging for the whole swath of white America.
Of course not. And I think you have to be right. There's a lot of fear.
Guys, I'm so sorry. I have to cut this off because I have to take questions. We're going to run out of time. If it were up to me, we would do this for another 2 hours. But as you can see, there are quite a few. Since the mic is over here, I'm going to start with the gentleman right here in the shirt. I'm sorry to cut you guys off. Forgive me.
I'm sorry to cut off too. Thank you. Great panel discussion. I've got 2 quick comments and a question. The first comment is, I think, to Patricia, the comment about how Obama couldn't be seen with African-American children or in African-American churches, I don't think is uniquely racial. It's sort of the Nixon going to China phenomenon, that it's only from the people from whom you don't expect that move, those are the only people that can do it. So I think that's not just a racial, I think that's a American political phenomenon that only a very conservative Republican could make a trip to a communist country and not be just killed politically. My other comment is that I don't see how you can call this country post-racial. I'll quote a panel I heard earlier. We have 1 black president and 1 million black men in prison. There's just no way to call this country post-racial until this whole society is. My question, though, is I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about Michelle Obama, because she was a real lightning rod during the early parts of the campaign when she dared to talk about some of her racial experiences in America. The whole comment about the first time I was ever proud, and people started saying she hates white people, she's un-American, she's an unpatriotic, and then she immediately retreated and sort of went back into a more traditional first lady role. Can you talk about how she was perceived and how you think she's perceived now?
Sure. That's interesting. That comment that she made, I guess, right before the Wisconsin primary, for the first time in my life, I'm proud of my country, and in fact, got her into a hell of a lot of trouble. If you go back to her thesis that she wrote when she was at Princeton, when she talked about feeling like a stranger and unwelcome on campus, it's a straight line to that comment. I think it reflected what she really felt. I think what she was saying, in effect, was that she was a product of a country where she just never thought it imaginable. They would elect somebody like her husband as president, and now they were doing that. Well, by God, I'm moved. I'm proud. I feel things I've never felt before. She couldn't say that in the context of a campaign. So all of a sudden, you have her spokesman says, well, she didn't really mean what she said. What she really meant was that she's proud that Americans are getting involved in the political process. That's what she really meant. Well, nonsense. I mean, she meant what she said. But she couldn't say that. And I think that the reality of it is that her husband had been a politician for some time. She had not. Her husband was very skilled at avoiding these kinds of things. She was not. But she was all of a sudden put out there speaking in major venues.
But nor was he a skilled politician, and yet the analog for him is the Gates arrest, isn't it?
Right.
That was interesting because it's sort of the same kind of phenomenon, but it was not quite as blatant. I mean, you didn't have people jumping up as Cindy McCain did after Michelle's comment saying, "I'm patriotic. I've always been patriotic."
But I submit it was far more consequential that the president, as the chief law enforcement officer of the land, opined about the racial profiling of this distinguished Harvard superstar.
Oh yeah, one of his staff folks and I had a conversation in the aftermath of that event, which he did backpedal from, and he said, well, his first reaction, he was being Barack Obama, a black man. The second reaction, he was being president.
I understand.
Yeah,
the morphology here, but the point is that it, I think, has given a kind of tincture to his performance from that point on. You say, shouldn't he have just said one more word about this? It really wouldn't have cost him probably too many votes. Couldn't he have just been have another ictus there? And
one more word, which would have been what?
Well, it depends on what the situation would be, but it seems that he
should have
is a
said
little
it's an
guns.
open case. I have no comment. He really should
Oh
have.
yes, of course.
And he knows it.
Yeah, we all know.
No, that's not my point. I'm talking about.
Not Ben. No, absolutely not. No.
I quite agree.
But are you saying, David, he should have gone further along the road he went down the first time?
Well, the two ways of looking at that. He invited that question, of course, which became so fateful. It didn't just come. Please ask this question at the end of the healthcare discussion or presentation. So healthcare was, in a sense, infected by this obiter dicta.
It was totally obscured.
Can
I just say one word about Michelle Obama, though? I mean, because I think Michelle Obama has been the source of some very interesting discussion within women's groups, and in terms of her symbolism as a liberated woman or as a woman, as a contemporary feminist symbol. And it's a division between the perception among black women and among white women that has has afflicted us since the 70s. Which is that, I think for many African American women, the aspiration, even when I was in college, was to become seen as more beautiful, as more acceptable. Not to say that to be accepted is to be romanticized. I mean, not to be in love with romance, but to be a romantic object to some degree. Not always to be associated with being more masculine or not feminine or not a woman. Ain't I a woman too? Basically, is our legacy. And for many white women, it was to come off that pedestal of prettiness and to join the workforce. And black women who have worked since they were brought to these shores, there was an old statement of, that when you get married, your husband sets you down in black society, that it was actually, that the status symbol was going in the opposite direction. And so during the campaign, there were many people who, and even now, who were critical of her for giving up her job, for becoming a full-time homemaker with the traditional role of First Lady, of having causes and no job. But for many African Americans, for her to become a fashion plate, to be in vogue, to be this is again a kind of reversal of roles. It speaks against. I mean, it's a reversal that is effective in a way that speaks to a specific history, even as it doesn't speak to the general history of white women in this country. And to be a black first lady, not just a woman, not just a female, not to be biologized in that sense, but to be a black first woman with a husband who adores her and seems to have more, sort of like general physical energy between the two of them than any people in the White House we've seen in many years, is something which is very gratifying. And so I think that's, it plays against the traditional stereotype of black women, even as it's, and I think it's also edgy for white women, but I frequently hear white women intersecting with her a little bit differently. So I just wanted to say that.
We probably can only get 2 or 3 more in. Sorry, but time is always short. Please, though.
Well, the conversation's been so great. But you've made passing reference to something that I think is the elephant in the room on this post-racial. I think it's the media. I don't think that we're in a post-racial society, especially insofar as the media are concerned. I think we're in a pre-1968, pre-Kerner Commission society in which, if you'll remember, the Kerner Commission conclusion was that the media were partly responsible for the explosions that happened in this country because you didn't have enough representation from those communities that were exploding. And with all due respect to people like yourself and the young man I spoke with this morning who's about to go to the White House as a correspondent, black young man, when I come back to this country from South Africa and look at who is analyzing and who is reporting on this moment, we're in a pre-1968 moment. I'm here in Aspen. I was introduced to Aspen by Ed Bradley. We don't have an Ed Bradley in the media anymore. And I don't know whether that is partly responsible for this, but it just seems to me that we don't have enough diversity in our representation of those who are analyzing the president and his policies. And to me, that's not post-racial. That's pre-1968, pre-Kerner. That was a question.
As a member of the media, that's hard. Because I agree with most of it. I think the only answer I can give is that some of us are trying. We hope to do better.
Can I also, I think that's why it's important to sort of tease out what Ellis was saying. Because I do think that that it's more complex than simply we don't have an Ed Bradley. If you look at Fox, we have a great diversity of token faces saying all the same thing. We don't have a diversity of opinion or political perspective, and we have a whole lot of paid toadies saying things that, we say, it can't be racist because after all, look, we have, I forget Michelle, whatever her name is on Fox, and so you have black and Asian and Hispanic faces saying the most incredibly racist, awful things. And so I do think there's a crisis in the media, and it isn't just the absence, there's been an affirmative infusion of right-wing fiction making. Now, I also think that, I agree, I think we're moving, and I said this yesterday for those of you who were on who heard the panel yesterday, that we're moving from a system of hypodescent, which is a system in which you have sort of one drop rule, which is a system in which you determine race by the parentage of the least status in society. So one drop of black, which is the lesser status, then makes everybody who has that drop black. And we're moving to a system, I think, of hyperdescent, which is more the Latin American or Caribbean situation, in which if you have one drop of a parent of the superior or more dominant social class, then you become a member of that, or at least a buffer member. And I think that's why I worry about biracial and all of these exceptionalized categories into which Obama fits in various parts of himself, because it reinscribes mulatto and quadroon and octoroon and all of this sort of thing, which were categories of privilege, but it's very Latin American in that it has a kind of hierarchy of privilege based on color, perhaps, and I think there are other things that, like class, that we can put into that as well. But what I think is happening in the United States is we're moving from not just we're still calling it a black-white divide, but it's a divide that used to be characterized as white, non-white. And so white was the dominant and powerful, privileged category, and anybody who was non-white, including Jews, including Southern Europeans, could hope to aspire or to assimilate over time into that category of whiteness, to be as much like white Anglo-Saxon as Protestant as possible. And that was the definition of the American dream. We have moved, I think, now to a black, not black category. so that so that the category of privilege is being not black, and that can include a whole range of potential, white Cubans, Latinos who are not too dark, people who are who are migrating from South Asia, from certain darker parts of Africa, but nevertheless who have class benefits of one sort or another. But the bottom and unyielding category in both of these, in white, not white, and black, not black, is black on the bottom, and that's reflected in the actual data of where of incarceration, of housing segregation, and so forth. But this movement is allowing a very stagnant stasis at the bottom, but at the same time to congratulate ourselves that, well, look, we're much more of a rainbow in the privileged category. But again, the bottom divide between black and not black is unyielding.
Claude, you wanted to answer. I think we can get in one more question, regrettably, after Claude.
Okay, I just wanted to get in one quick comment, because I think what Charlene said is very interesting. I don't think it's just a lack of an Ed Bradley, though I do think, and this is maybe building on what Patricia said, I think there's a real shift in the culture, in the culture of African Americans and Latinos that I was trying to allude to this in my opening statement, that I think there is in play a much more individualistic model of advancement and mobility out there that's available to those young people who are now working in the media and working really in every walk of life, and it's very disadvantageous for them to pick up a collective concern. That can put them at jeopardy. That's almost the opposite of whistling Vivaldi. And it puts them under suspicion. It seems like a throwback. It seems like it's baggage. It seems like it sort
of breaks. You don't want to be the black reporter.
It's almost like it's breaking a trust that we're just about to have, because we are hopeful that this trust is getting there. And so the cost of expressing that, I think, has changed compared to what it was in those days. And it just seems like there's this fundamental shift. I don't know another way to say that, but that's what I mean. That fact of life, that elephant in the room, that situation, that predicament, is worrisome to me in light of the fact that these inequalities persist. Because how will there then be a voice that directs attention to their remedy?
We got one more. How about right here?
Thanks. This is a great discussion. My question is about conservative criticism of Obama. At what point and how do you go about distinguishing between a kind of critique that's a code word for a racial critique, and then when does that then become a way of sort of shutting down or marginalizing what could be a legitimate political criticism by simply chalking that up to a kind of racism? And I'm thinking specifically of the Tea Party movement, which I think probably combines elements of both. People who are ideologically concerned about big government, but maybe who are also very much racially uncomfortable with a black president.
Well, I mean, I don't think you necessarily even need to separate. I think you take it on for what it is and you analyze what they're saying. I mean, I called up the fellow who runs something called teaparty.org out of curiosity, and we had a nice conversation. And he was talking about, we want to take the country back, et cetera, et cetera. I said, well, and who do you want to take the country back from? And he paused for a second. He said, big businesses, corporations. None of these people, except those who are really, really, really way out there in the fringe, are ever going to acknowledge that what they are saying has any racial component to it. That's become just not allowed in civil discourse in American society anymore. I think those of us who take on the responsibility of trying to interpret these things have to bring our own awareness and our own sensibilities to bear and say, well, this thing is clearly some racial component, this thing is not. Sure, they may have some legitimate grievance about a certain set of government policies, maybe they don't. But I don't really see a need to try to say, in effect, these are good guys because they're not racist, and these are the racist, sort of Tea Party types. I don't really see why you need to do that.
And the paranoid style has been a perennial in American politics, hasn't it?
Any closing remarks before we go? Remarks. How can I refuse, Doctor?
I don't know how this is going to come out, but I want to tell you that I've been frustrated during this panel about the intellectual nature of it and not the non-personal. I'm 66 years old. It was 6 years ago that I realized I was really ignorant, thinking I had a pretty good education, pretty good life experience. What I realized was that by chance, I was born in America 66 years ago, white, male, and of educated parents. The odds of that worldwide are less than 0.25%. I'm on the most privileged class. And just the timing of it all was that the whites in America were the majority, and they set the rules. Until I heard from others through leadership training and so forth, and diversity training, about their life experience, I thought I knew it all. Now I feel I'm handicapped because I didn't live the life of the majority of the people on the planet, people of color. And until we talk about privilege, birth chance, and get down to the personal experiences of each other, we're going to continue to have this stupid intellectual debate, that's going on, fed by the media because they like to create conflict. So I look forward to 2050 when whites are in the minority. I think we will be a much kinder, more compassionate country. And I do believe that the people of color have a richer life experience. To me, Obama grew up in Hawaii. Think about the richness of that society and the way they think. And you might understand why he's the way he is. But until we get out of our mindset and our frame and our birth chance, I don't think we're going to have an honest conversation.
We have 2 seconds for a response if anybody.
We'll resume. I look forward to resuming it in 2020, 2050.
I mean, I would just say about the 2050 observation, that's based on obviously census projections going forth to inside the 2050 or 2040. But I think the problem with that kind of projection is it assumes we're going to have the same categories in 2040 and 2050 as we have now. I'm not at all convinced we will. I don't know whether we're going to become a majority, quote, minority country or not. I do know we have, by a semantical artifact, classified a lot of people as non-white who, where they came from, think they're white. So I'm not quite sure what those numbers mean in terms of where we're going.
Or the economic power and its distribution.
And I also think that it's, that to assume that simply because whites will be in a minority, that the power distribution will follow is to ignore South Africa, for example, or the history of many societies in which the power remains quite static, and that again, that's one thing that worries me about the dynamism of labeling while the power remains.
But apparently, we need another panel to talk about our personal stories.
But I also think that it's not just about personal stories. Part of what worries me is in the majority minority. That if, for example, we had a situation in which our democracy continues to fray by 2050. And the power follows those who are most educated, then it will also follow that according to racial lines. And so that, for me, implicates not just personal stories, but the structure and the funding of education and the way in which power is gives to certain populations and not. And so I am just as concerned about the structure as the personal stories.
I think we have to end there. I wish we could have got everyone's questions.